Friends, welcome back to the Love Your People Well podcast. We are going to dive today into the topic of passive-aggressive communication. That's not a fun topic, but the reality is it's super frustrating and it is not helpful in having the family life you want to have. And this podcast is all about helping you build healthy, happy, and holy family relationships. And your communication, the communication in your home, is a huge part of that. Now, as we jump into this conversation, we are going to be rooting our thoughts in Colossians chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. This is from the NIV, and what it says is, "Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator." When we think about passive-aggressive communication, now we'll talk about what that is and some examples today of what that might look like in your marriage or in your relationship with your kids. And then next week, we'll dive into some of those really practical ideas for how to stop it. We'll touch on that today, but we'll go deeper on that next week. But at the end of the day, when we think about passive-aggressive communication, it's a lie. We are lying to each other. And that is not helpful. It is not helpful. It does not make us happy, and it is not holy. And so I know that between this week and next week, this will be a helpful and practical conversation to help you strengthen family communication in your home. So again, welcome to the Love Your People Well podcast. If you're new here, I am glad that you're here, and I love tackling these communication topics because they're so practical and we all need them. So my name is Jess. I'm the host here of the Love Your People Well podcast. I am a marriage and family therapist. I'm a pastor's wife. I'm a mom of 4. And I so distinctly remember, it would probably gently fall into the passive-aggressive category, but I so remember when I first got married, it was over 10 years ago, and I had already been a therapist for over 10 years at that point. And so I felt pretty good about, I'm a marriage and family therapist. I know what to do. I know what not to do. I had lots of communication tips and tricks up my sleeve. And my husband and I really, for many reasons, mostly because he is so gracious and he is so kind and such a great communicator, we did not really have I can't think of any conflict while we were dating or engaged. And I so remember early in our marriage, it was a simple little thing. Basically, he had said he would be home at a certain time, and then he got caught up. He was doing something for church and he was busy, and he didn't call, he didn't check in. He just came home a few hours late, which meant I had a few hours of being annoyed, being angry, being worried, all of the emotions. That's a pretty classic thing early on in marriage. You're kind of still figuring out how do we include each other in everything that's going on. But what wound up happening is he got home thinking there's no problem. Like, it's not like we had a plan or something like we were going to do that we missed. He just had not thought to call. And I was so worked up in my emotions, he could tell pretty quickly, like, okay, what's wrong? He's asking me that question. And I so remember that sense of like, I know I need to be honest with you. I need to tell you why I'm upset. But I was really struggling to be vulnerable and share that. But I was also struggling to figure out, how do I say this? Because I'm very emotional. I don't want to start crying. I don't want to start yelling. And we worked through that. We had some really great conversations around that. But there was really an awareness for me in that moment. I was very tempted to lie. Colossians 3, do not lie to each other. I was very tempted to lie and kind of give that, everything's fine. Nothing's bothering me. Not necessarily even with the motive that like, I'll never share this with him, but really with the motive that I need to get myself together and figure out what I want to say. Now, there's a time for that. That can be very helpful, especially in the middle of a conflict, to take a little pause, figure out what you want to say so that you can say it calmly. But to be honest with him, to avoid passive aggressive communication with my husband in that moment, I needed to figure out, how do I communicate that I am upset and I do want to talk about that, but I need to figure out what to say or how to say it. I need us to work through this, not just jump straight to the hard conversation. And so I shared that example, not necessarily thinking you've had that same conversation, but because passive aggressive communication is such a common temptation, and it is so easy to slip into it. And I'm very thankful that the Lord, in that moment, it was early in our marriage, I'm thankful that he made me aware in the moment of that temptation. I don't remember what I said, but I know that I didn't just lie and say, no, I'm okay. I said something, I don't know, and we worked it through in that conversation. But that temptation to be passively aggressive with him was very strong. So let's jump into some examples here. Let's get a picture in our minds of what is passive aggressive communication. Where might it be in your own Christian home? And then, like I said, we'll touch on what to do about it, but we'll really dive into that more next week. Now, as we jump into this conversation, I'll just pause right here and remind you that we have several great freebies on the website and devotionals on the website, but we have two in particular that might be really helpful if you're really connecting with this struggle in communication. So you might want to grab my free one-page, like a cheat sheet, conflict resolution cheat sheet. That's, I guess, what it's called. Conflict resolution cheat sheet. It's a one-pager. It's quick, 3 steps to get you out of the conflict and back toward productive, peace-filled conversation. That's a freebie, the conflict resolution cheat sheet. And we also do have a marriage devotional on the website, 40-day devotional called Communicating to Connect, which really dives into scripture around communication with talking points every day to build conversation, particularly in your marriage. So both of those are at loveyourpeoplewell.com, and I'll put a link specifically to that freebie and that devotional in the show notes for today. So just wanted to remind you of those resources there on the website, loveyourpeoplewell.com. And before we go through more examples of passive-aggressive communication, let's chat for a minute about what it is. Because it's a thing where a lot of times we know it when we see it, or we know it when we feel it, or we know it when we hear a story. But what is it? And my summary would basically be that passive-aggressive communication is when we are speaking or acting in ways that express a negative emotion, frustration or disappointment or anger. We're expressing a negative emotion, but we're doing it in a very indirect way. It typically will include your tone of voice, your body language, and your behaviors or your actions. And so again, we think back to Colossians 3. Do not lie to each other, since you've taken off your old self and you've put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Lying to each other, being indirect with each other, is not the image of our creator. Now, negative emotions are going to happen, and we don't have to have a fight about all of them. But when we're expressing ourselves in a very indirect, kind of beating around the bush kind of way, it's not healthy, doesn't make us happy, and it is definitely not holy. It's going to hurt your family relationships. So let's dive into a few examples so you can maybe think about, is this sometimes happening in your own marriage or in your relationship with your kids? So here's a few examples. Do any of these sound familiar? Like I said before, claiming that you're fine when you are obviously, from your tone of voice, from your body language, you are upset and angry, but you're saying, I'm fine, not a big deal. Nope, didn't even notice. I'm fine. Nope, nothing going on. That would be passive aggressive. It's not being honest. What about this? Repeatedly complaining about a past event even though you're telling everyone, oh, I've forgiven them, or I've forgotten it, or it's not a problem. Now, forgiveness does not mean you have forgotten something happened, but when you're complaining and you keep bringing it up, then it's not honest to say, I've moved on, it's no big deal. What about the heavy sighs and the pouting and the slamming doors or the sullen, grumpy attitude, even though you're saying everything's fine and nothing is wrong? That body language / behavior, passive aggressive. Sarcasm is a really common one. You might hear that in your marriage. You might hear that with your kids. You might even hear it in your own head or as you're praying with the Lord. And another big one that I especially see as a marriage counselor is using the silent treatment. I'm not going to talk to them until they do XYZ, until they apologize, until whatever. Sometimes we don't even tell them that we're not talking to them. But avoiding people or using the silent treatment, these are all examples of passive-aggressive communication. It basically boils down to I'm feeling an emotion that either I don't want to feel or I don't know how to share about, but I'm going to let it come out in these indirect ways. It's dishonest and it's not helpful. So let me give a few examples specifically for your marriage, because passive-aggressive communication pops up in marriages all the time. Now, yes, the silent treatment, that is a really classic one. It's not solving anything. It's not working through the conflict. It's not building intimacy in your marriage. It's not ultimately honest or helpful. And one of the big ones that I see, especially for women, let's be honest, I'm not saying you do it, but it is very common, is that pattern of claiming to be fine when really you're not. And sometimes there's even kind of a built-in expectation that if my husband really loved me, he would know what I'm thinking or feeling. If my husband really knew me, he would know that that bothered me. And sometimes we're getting upset with our husband because he says, "Are you okay?" You say, "I'm fine," and then you get upset that he believes you. And that happens to me with my husband. Now, again, this is a temptation in my marriage that still pops up. Usually with not necessarily with a motive of I want to lie to you or I want to hurt you, but with a motive of it's really hard to be vulnerable. I really don't want to be upset about this thing. I don't think I should be. I think it's silly, and yet I am. And so if I say I'm not, I'm being dishonest. Another big example that happens in marriages is procrastinating on taking care of something that you know is important to the other person. Now, you might genuinely sometimes forget to fill up the gas tank in the car, or move the laundry from the washer to the dryer, like whatever, get his shirts from the dry cleaner. You might genuinely forget things. Or sometimes you might be angry or annoyed and use the I forgot card when really you were just trying to get back to them or refuse to do something or kind of prick them in a little annoying way. Now, friend, I'm not saying you do these things. I'm not saying your husband does these things. I'm saying as a marriage counselor for over 20 years, a lot of couples do these little things that just poke at each other with dishonesty. And it's passive aggressive. But let's think, before we wrap up today, let's think too about our parenting. Usually in parenting, we're getting frustrated that our kids, especially maybe tweens and teens, are showing passive aggressive behavior toward us. But plenty of moms are showing passive aggressive behavior toward their kids as well. We don't even always realize it. So sarcasm is another big one here. I hear moms say that sometimes to their toddlers. They finally finish their temper tantrum or, and they're saying something like, well, of course you're whining. What other option is there? Oh, you're finally done. Well, I guess we can keep shopping now. And they're just releasing a little bit of their own frustration, but in a sarcastic and ultimately hurtful, definitely not helpful way. Sometimes we hear backhanded compliments. Wow, your hair actually looks good today. I guess you finally took some time to comb it. I don't even like saying these examples. They're common and they're they're small, and so they kind of prick under the skin, but they can be so damaging. But I'll say one more, a parenting example: lying to your kids to avoid their reaction to something. I see that happen a lot for parents. They know their kid is going to be upset or whine or complain or whatever, and so they just don't tell the truth, or they skirt around the truth, or they sort of kind of maybe blame somebody else. Honesty is a huge part of healthy and happy and holy family relationships. Now, of course, as I said before, I hope none of these things are happening in your home. But I know that because they're small, often they can be much bigger, but generally they're kind of small, easy to go under the radar little moments. And we can really feel such big emotions, frustration or annoyance or anger. It can be really tough. So what do we do if some of these things are happening? Now, we're going to dive deep into this next week. Make sure to subscribe to the show. It'll pop right up there in your library. But ultimately, if these things are hitting close to home, you're not alone. These are common struggles. It's really hard to manage big emotions, hard emotions, especially when you're busy and there's a million things going on. But when you notice that emotion and that temptation with it, I don't need to tell the truth about this. I can just avoid this. It's not a big deal. You might be telling yourself that lie. Bite your tongue and try something different. Bite your tongue and probably do the opposite. If you find yourself tempted to say, no, honey, I'm fine, when you're not, do the opposite. You know, honey, I'm really struggling. I don't think I can talk about it right now, but I'm struggling. It's really hard to break bad habits, and I know next week's conversation will be more detailed. But right now, if you notice it, you notice that temptation, bite your tongue and do the opposite. It won't solve every problem, but it's a really great start. And you can grab that free resource, Conflict Resolution Cheat Sheet, dive into a devotional to improve communication in your marriage. All of that is at loveyourpeoplewell.com. And make sure to subscribe so that next week we can get more practical tips for how to handle and stop passive-aggressive communication in your home. All right, hugs and blessings to you, my friend. I'll talk to you soon.